I want to talk about something that's been on my mind for a little while now, and it comes from something that I heard a lot growing up. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. Of course, I would hear this when I did something wrong, made a mistake, or didn't really understand what I was exactly supposed to do yet. And I think for a long time, I didn't process it the way it was intended. Or, I mean, I couldn't, right? It didn't land as you made a mistake, it landed as there's something wrong with you. And that's where it gets kind of complicated because when you're a kid, you're still learning how the world works. You don't really have a strong separation yet between what you do and who you are. So when an adult responds to your behavior with something like, you should be ashamed of yourself, it doesn't stay neatly attached to the behavior. It tends to attach itself to identity. And once that happens enough times, it can really start to shape how you see yourself without you even realizing it. Not just I did something wrong, but more like I am wrong. And I think that distinction matters a lot more than people realize because I've been thinking about how shame is often talked about like it's some normal internal emotion that we generate ourselves, like it just naturally comes up when we do something bad or wrong or embarrassing. But I don't think that it starts that way for most people. In fact, it obviously doesn't because it's completely learned from the outside environment. It gets introduced to us first from the way people react to us, their tone, from punishment, from disappointment, and statements exactly like you ought to be ashamed of yourself. And when you're young enough, you don't really have the tools to separate those things out. So instead of thinking that behavior wasn't okay, it turns into I'm not okay. And over time, that becomes automatic. You make a mistake, and there's this immediate internal reaction, not just regret, but something like self judgment or self rejection. A sense that you've crossed some kind of line that has to do with who you are, not just what you did. We make mistakes. And that's supposed to be a part of learning. That's literally how you figure things out as you grow up in the world. You try, you mess up, you adjust, you try again. But shame doesn't really support that process. Shame tends to make everything about identity. It turns a moment into like a verdict. And when that happens in early life, it can shape the way someone handles not just their mistakes, but risk, visibility, expression, even relationships. Because if mistakes feel like proof that there's something wrong with you, then naturally you start trying to avoid mistakes at all costs, which can turn into a lot of things over time, like overthinking, self censoring, people pleasing, avoiding trying new things, or just constantly monitoring yourself from the outside like you're waiting to be corrected. And that's a lot like self surveillance, right? That's what it becomes. And I don't think that most people realize how early that kind of pattern starts. Because when you're a child, you're not just learning behavior, you're learning how to interpret yourself. You're learning what your internal experience means. So if the message you consistently receive is that mistakes should produce shame, then you start building an internal system that does that automatically. You don't need someone else to say it anymore. You just shame yourself. And I don't think that people are doing this necessarily because anyone is trying to harm a child. Of course, I don't necessarily believe that at all. A lot of it is just how people were taught themselves. You know, it gets passed down without much reflection. And as a result of that, I'm reflecting. It's worth questioning whether it actually helps because I don't really think that children need shame in order to learn. They need feedback, boundaries, guidance, corrections sometimes, of course, sure, right? Of course. But those things don't have to come with identity level judgment. You can tell a child something wasn't okay without telling them they should feel ashamed of who they are. And that's a really important distinction to make because one teaches accountability, the other teaches self rejection. And I just keep coming back to this idea that a lot of what we think of as normal emotional development can actually include a lot of unnecessary weight that gets carried forward from childhood. Sometimes things that feel like just how people are, but are actually learned responses to how we were treated when we were younger. I mean, we all know this, right? And shame might be one of the biggest ones, because if you grow up associating mistakes with shame, you don't just learn how to avoid mistakes, you learn how to turn inward on yourself every time you're imperfect. And nobody's perfect. So that's a lot of self-shaming. And it can follow you for a lifetime. I know that it did for me until I was able to take it apart and understand it. It took a very long time. So I don't think we should be telling children that they should be ashamed of themselves for making mistakes while they're still learning how to navigate the world. Mistakes are part of learning. And shame, that just gets in the way of that process.